The Horse and His Boy by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 7, Part 2. Aravis arrives in Tashbaan. When Aravis had finished telling her story, Lazraline said, "But darling, why don't you marry Ashoka Tarkan? Everyone's crazy about him. My husband says he is beginning to be one of the greatest men in Kalaman. He has just been made Grand Vizier now old Arthaxa has died. Didn't you know?" "I don't care. I can't stand the sight of him," said Aravis. "But darling, only think. 3 palaces, and one of them, that beautiful one down at the lake of Ilkeen. Positively ropes of pearls, I'm told, baths of ass's milk, and you'd see such a lot of me. He can keep his pearls and palaces as far as I am concerned," said Aravis. "You always were a queer girl, Aravis," said Lazraline. "What more do you want?" In the end, however, Aravis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest, and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting the 2 horses out of the north gate and then on to the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river, and Lazraline had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Aravis herself. She suggested that she could be carried out in the litter with the curtains drawn, but Lazraline told her that litters were only used in the city, and that the sight of one going out through the gate would be certain to lead to questions. When they had talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Aravis found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Lazraline clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea. There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrock's garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there is a little water door. Only for the palace people, of course, but then, you know, dear," here she tittered a little, "we almost are palace people. I say, it is lucky that you came to visit me. The dear Tisrock, may he live forever, is so kind. We are asked to the palace almost every day, and it is like a second home. I love all the dear princes and princesses, and I positively adore Prince Rabadash. I might run in and see any of the palace ladies at any hour of the day or night. Why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside it, and even if we are caught, all would be lost," said Aravis. "Oh, darling, don't get so excited," said Lazraline. "I was going to say, even if we were caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad jokes, and getting quite well known for them. Only the other day, do listen, dear, this is frightfully funny. I meant all would be lost for me," said Aravis, a little sharply. "Oh, yes, I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can you think of any better plan?" Aravis couldn't, and answered, "No, we'll have to risk it. Can we start tonight?" "Oh, not tonight," said Lazraline. "Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes. The whole palace will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It will have to be tomorrow night." This was bad news for Aravis, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Lazraline went out to the banquet, for Aravis was very tired of her giggling and her talk about dresses and parties and weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Lazraline wanted to go back on the whole arrangement and kept on telling Aravis that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice and inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. "And with that peasant boy, too," said Lazraline. "Darling, think of it, it is not nice." Aravis had thought of it a good deal, but she was so tired of Lazraline's silliness by now that, for the first time, she began to think that travelling with Shasta was really rather more fun than fashionable life in Tashbaan. So she only replied, "You forget, I'll be nobody, just like him, when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised." "And to think," said Lazraline, almost crying, "that if only you had have sense, you could be the wife of a Grand Vizier." Aravis went away to have a private word with the horses. "You must go with a groom a little before sunset down to the tombs," she said. "No more of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again. But there'll have to be food in Hwyn's saddlebags and a full water skin behind yours, Brie. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge." "And then to Narnia and the north," whispered Brie. "But what if Shasta is not at the tombs?" "Wait for him, of course," said Aravis. "I hope you've been quite comfortable." "Never been better stabled in my life," said Brie. "But if the husband of that tittering Tarkina friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, then I think the head groom is cheating him." Aravis and Lazraline had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later, they were ready to start. Aravis was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house and wore a veil over her face. They had agreed that if any questions were asked, Lazraline would pretend that Aravis was a slave she was taking as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here there were, of course, soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Lazraline quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A fair number of courtiers, slaves, and others were still moving about here, but this only made the two girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the hall of pillars, and then into the hall of statues, and down the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description. What they could see of it in the dim light of the lamps. Presently, they came out in the garden court which sloped downhill in a number of terraces. On the far side, they came to the old palace. It had already grown almost quite dark, and now they find themselves in a maze of corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed in brackets to the walls. Lazraline halted at a place where you had to go either left or right. Do go on," whispered Aravis, whose heart was beating terribly, and who still felt that her father might run into them at any corner. "I am just wondering," said Lazraline. "I'm not absolutely sure which way we should go from here. I think it's the left." "Yes, I'm almost sure that it is the left. What fun this is!" They took the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lighted at all, and which soon began going down the steps. "It's all right," said Lazraline. "I am sure we're right now. I remember these steps." But at that moment, a moving light appeared ahead. A second later, there appeared from round a distant corner the dark shapes of two men walking backwards and carrying tall candles. And of course, it is only before royalties that people walk backwards. Aravis felt Lazraline grip her arm, that sort of sudden grip, which is almost a pinch, and which means that the person who is gripping you is very frightened indeed. Aravis thought it odd that Lazraline should be so afraid of the Tisroc, if he were really such a great friend of hers, but there was no time to go on thinking. Lazraline was hurrying her back to the top of the steps, on tiptoes and groping wildly along the wall. "Here's a door," she whispered. quick! They went in, drew the door very softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Aravis could hear by Lazreline's breathing that she was terrified. "Das preserves," whispered Lazreline. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward into the room and blundered onto a sofa. "Let's lie down behind it," whimpered Lazreline. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall, and the two girls got down. Lazreline managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Aravis' face stuck out beyond the sofa, so that if anyone came into the room with a light and happened to look in exactly the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once have looked like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Aravis shoved desperately to try and make Lazreline give her a little more room, but Lazreline, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Aravis, at last in the tiniest possible whisper. I think so," began Lazreline, "but my poor nerves—" And then came the most terrible noise they could have heard at that moment. The noise of the door opening.
Oh.
And then came light. And because Aravis couldn't get her head any further behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves, deaf and dumb, as Aravis rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret councils, walking backwards and carrying the candles. They took up their stand, one at each end of the sofa. This was a good thing, for of course it was now harder for anyone to see Aravis once a slave was in front of her, and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap by which he immediately knew he was a Tisroc. The least of the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all of the clothes and weapons of the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat, and such a mass of frills and plaits and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans, that Aravis couldn't help thinking that the Narnian fashions, at any rate for men, looked nicer. After him came a tall young man with a feathered and jewelled turban on his head and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little humpback, wizened old man, in whom she recognized with a shudder as a new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ashoka Tarkhan himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan with a sigh of contentment, and the young man took his place, standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid his face flat on the carpet.
Yeah.